I'm Jen Patia Howell. I'm the co-executive director of Virginia Civics. We run the Virginia We the People program. I'll have my fellow judges introduce themselves, and then we'll ask you to introduce yourselves and your coach.
Good afternoon. My name is Emanuel Caudillo. I'm a senior advisor with the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanics. Welcome.
And I'm Roger DeRozier, and I'm the state coordinator for the We the People program in Massachusetts. And I also welcome you as well.
And you are?
I'm Amelia Kincaid, and I'm in 8th grade.
I'm Anjali Jaster, and I am also in 8th grade.
I'm James Westerberg, and I'm also in 8th grade.
I am Tessa Cleveland, and I am also in 8th grade.
And are your teachers, coaches here with us today?
Yeah, Mike and Susan.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for taking the time to do this and to do this in this crazy format. It's been going pretty well, so nothing to worry about. I'm going to go ahead and read the entire question, and then time will start when you're ready to begin, okay?
My computer turned off.
Okay. What were the founders' ideas about presidential powers, and how has presidential power changed throughout American history? What are the qualifications for president, and how should presidents be selected? What role, if any, does Congress and the Supreme Court have in checking actions of the president? How much power, if any, does the president have for making war? You may begin.
Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "Let us never forget that government is ourselves and not an alien power over us. The ultimate rulers of our democracy are not the president and senators and congressmen and government officials, but the voters of this country." FDR's thoughts lined up with what the founders believed.
The founders were afraid to have an all-powerful leader who could overthrow the other branches. They remembered life under Great Britain's rule, and they did not want to repeat the autocracy they had experienced. During the 1800s and until the 1930s, Congress had the most power. But over time, the powers of the executive branch have grown, and the president has more influence than when the Constitution was written.
As the executive branch grew, it became difficult for presidents and their staff to manage. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created the Executive Office of the President. The EOP helped the president manage their branch.
Until 1921, departments and agencies from all branches submitted budget requests directly to Congress. Then, Congress passed a law called the Budget and Accounting Act. This law gave the president the responsibility to assemble budgets and submit them to Congress. In 1939, FDR moved this to the EOP. Another example of the president's power growing is that during Washington's administration, there were only 3 departments: State, Treasury, and War. The executive branch now contains 15.
To be president, you must be at least 35 years old, have been a resident in the U.S. for at least 14 years, and have been born in the United States. Currently, the president is elected through the Electoral College, which was designed to keep a populist president from getting elected. In recent history, there has been a move to abolish the Electoral College as it does not produce the results of the majority as intended.
We believe that the Electoral College should be abolished because it is outdated and does not give citizens the vote that the founders had wanted. Our country is more populated than when the founders gathered, so when using the Electoral College, many votes do not count and people are not heard. For example, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016 by 5 million people, yet she still lost because of the Electoral College.
Congress and the Supreme Court can check virtually everything the president does. Checks and balances provide a way for the other branches to check the actions of the president and executive branch. The president can appoint people for important roles as the executive and judicial branch with the advice and consent of the Senate. The president can negotiate treaties, but the Senate has to approve. The president can veto laws, but Congress can override them with a 2/3 majority in both houses.
A specific example of checks and balances was most recently seen in the legislative branch with the impeachment hearings of our current president. An example of the Supreme Court checking an executive order is the case Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. versus Sawyer, 1952. President Truman attempted to take over most steel mills during the Korean War. The Supreme Court determined that the president did not have the power to do this, and the order was rescinded.
The president does not have much power in starting or creating war, but they do have power once war has started. The power of declaring war is reserved for Congress, but the president can command armed forces and make treaties with the approval of the Senate. The War Powers Resolution Act of 1973 attempted to reinforce the Constitution as U.S. citizens were wary of their president engaging in war without the consent of Congress. Truman had committed to the Korean War, and Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon had overseen the undeclared conflict in Vietnam. The effectiveness of the War Powers Act is debatable.
In recent years, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel has claimed that the Constitution authorizes the president to order the military to attack other countries without congressional permission. President Trump was able to launch missile strikes in Syria because he claimed it was in national interest, there were no troops on the ground, and there was little risk of escalation. As the power of the president has increased, it appears to have grown in the ability to engage in war as well. We are now open for questions.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. Going back to the Constitutional Convention and some of the debates that the founders had over the creation of the presidency, what were some of the considerations that they had? Did they all sort of agree on what the executive should look like, or were there disagreements there?
There were definitely disagreements because there were framers at the convention who wanted to have a stronger federal government and with the executive branch, but there were others that were more focused on the power to the people.
Okay. Next question here is, how much power should a president have in a national emergency?
I personally think that a president should have just a moderate amount of power in an emergency, just because if the president is given too much power during an emergency, it could cause issues with not having agreements in what the president wants to enforce and with what the rest of the government and the people want to enforce. But I think that it's also important to make sure that the president has enough power to be able to enact and do things very quickly in order to help with the emergency.
Can you expand on that with regard to the coronavirus pandemic that we're going through?
Yeah, so I think that in for closing and reopening states, I think that that should be a state decision, not a national decision, just because I think that having the president be able to open and reopen the country is too much power, and I think that the country, in terms of coronavirus cases, isn't all at the same spot. So I think it's important to do it state by state instead of nationally.
Okay, I have a question with regard to the impeachment process. Do you think that this has become too much of a political issue? Does it remain, or does it still reflect the view that the framers had of what the impeachment process should be as they envisioned it?
I think that the framers definitely don't envision it as exactly how it is today. I think they probably wanted more power to the people to do that, because during impeachments, it can be very one-sided based on what the houses are controlled by, which party they're controlled by.
Can you expand on that?
Well, I would say that the majority of the vote they would think would go to the people and how they wanted their president, if they still wanted him or her to be impeached or not, and if they thought that they were still right for the country, for that national interest in them, I guess.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question about electoral college. You brought that up, and you made very clear that you think it should go away. So can you explain to me what was the intent of the electoral college, and specifically why do you think it doesn't work anymore?
I think that the intent of the electoral college was just to make voting, I guess, a little bit easier. And I think if it were to be abolished, it would be better for the smaller states. I mean, the bigger states, because they would get more of a say in the election. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the reason that it doesn't work anymore is just because of how many people there are, and then in terms of how many votes are just lost from individual voters voting and then going into the electoral college.
So why did the founders want electoral college rather than just a popular vote to begin with?
I think they wanted the electoral college to make sure that the smaller states wouldn't get drowned out and they still had a say in the government.
I agree. Also, it was to keep one president, a populist president, from getting elected. So, yeah.
Here, I might have a question. I have 1 minute left, so I think we can get this question in. You talk about how the president's power has been growing since the 1930s. Do you think there should be more limits to presidential powers than what they are today? And if so, what do you think they should be?
I think there should be more limits on the presidential powers, especially when you're thinking about executive orders, because the president can pretty much make whatever decision they want using an executive order, and there aren't a lot of checks on it. Yes, the Supreme Court can declare it unconstitutional, but from what I know, that hasn't happened very often. So using the executive orders, the president can get whatever done they want to.
Oh, perfect timing.
Great timing. All right. Well, we have a little bit of feedback for you before we let you go. I want to say I really enjoyed particularly your opening statement. I thought you put in a whole lot of detail in there, some things that we have not heard today. And so I just, the amount of research that went into that, I commend you on it. I thought it was a very strong opening statement. In terms of the follow-up questions, I think, maybe just a little bit more detail in there. I think you have very strong, you have a very strong foundation, but I think you can build on it, right? So all of those great examples that you had in your opening, you can bring some of that stuff in to your follow-up questions as well, and just make, make even stronger points with all of that supporting evidence. But I really enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed, the sort of sentiment of the power of the people, and how that was at the very forefront of our founders' thinking, and when they created the Constitution, and particularly the presidency. So great job. Thank you all so much for doing this, Daniel.
Well, I'd like to commend you on a great presentation. I liked how you framed it, your presentation, for the most part, on FDR, because this is during his presidential term that presidential powers really increased. Of course, they came during two crises, the Great Depression and World War II. And so it was great to see how you made that transition using FDR. And I think that was very interesting, and interesting way of your presentation. And I found it very, very well. I enjoyed just your question, your response to your questions there. Just to enhance your presentation, you did a lot in regards to talking about congressional checks, such as overriding vetoes and so forth. Something to enhance it for next time is, to use the side of oversight, where you can bring in, Congress could bring in presidential appointees or their folks in front of them and say, hey, what's going on? So that's another tool in checking on the executive branch, and that's just a suggestion to use to enhance your presentation. But overall, I thoroughly thank you so much for your presentation, and good job. Thank you.
Well, the third man always has the chance of being able to say, I agree with my colleagues. But your presentation was indeed spot on. It really, really allowed us to get a glimpse of a very solid understanding of what you understood from the questions that were being asked. And I agree with my colleagues. It was really nice to hear you be able to say that Congress really led the way pretty much up to the time of FDR, in that from that moment on, the presidency, okay, has grown in power. And you gave good examples, and you were able to make that understood. You were able to give us the checks that were needed. You gave us some good examples and a lot of current examples as well to solidify the points that you were trying to make. In the area that you needed to improve is something that the first judge was able to tell you, and that is you had that information, and then when you were answering our questions, you needed to give a little bit more depth, okay, to your responses. So that what seemed to lack was the lack of examples to back up what you were trying to tell us. It wasn't that you weren't giving us information, but you weren't backing it up with the examples that you were giving us in your presentation. So that would have been very helpful. Although I must admit that when you were asked that last question, you hit it right out the park when you said executive powers. You were so good. If you could have given us one example of what you meant by executive power, just think of how much power would have been behind that response. So that's just one example of how much, okay, more, okay, that would have, okay, been an extraordinary example, if that makes any sense to you. Overall, just understand, you have accomplished so much, and I hope that you realize that this is extraordinary. I hope that this experience, okay, gives you so much more going forward in your education, because you have set the bar. So please take this, go forward with it. I am so proud of you, and I know that your teachers are as well. You should go from this moment and just go screaming out of the room and say, yes, I did it. Great, great job.
Thank you so much.
All right, judges, I'm going to put you into a breakout room real quickly.